All right, man. Good to see you.
Same here.
I'm really excited about this conversation. We've covered resonance and energy, and today we're going to talk about a word that has come to mean a lot to your work, anti-fragility.
Yep.
And one of the main reasons that I reached out to you in the first place was my enthusiasm for how you view the world through this lens. And so, I'd really just love to start with a really basic question, which is, as you and Adam zeroed in on anti-fragility, and maybe you can just put words before we even dive into what it is, kind of like what drew you to anti-fragility as a concept, why it's important at this moment in time, and kind of how you're seeing anti-fragility overall.
This is an oversimplification, but I think, appears over the course of decades that the study of, let's say, well being and human potential was dominated by a break fix model. How do we identify what is wrong and make it right? Right. And in a response to that, a field that I love and have a lot of respect for, but I think maybe created some unintentional problems, and that's positive psychology or the study of human flourishing. Some of the message started to go the other way. And what we now know is something like toxic positivity.
Mm.
You can just sort of think things away. Some other messaging around kind of the role of positive emotions, and there's a both and here.
Yeah.
And when Adam and I came together through a series of different events and from our different perspectives, I think we really implicitly agreed on that notion that there's a both and. And so when it comes to anti fragility, the goal is still, and I say goal, but what we mean goal is mastery goal, like a process. The ongoing process to focus on is thriving, is flourishing. It's just that it incorporates what we know from a variety of different fields is high utility about unpleasant experiences and pleasant experiences.
Mm.
And it's
Yeah.
really trying to integrate those two. And so to just kind of give, a visual to the listeners, the way we talk about this is if you think of, let's take like Marty Seligman's language, if you think of happiness or flourishing or contentment on a linear scale, which plenty of people argue it should not be thought of that way, but let's keep it simple. And so a break fix model is, hey, I'm at a -5 in terms of how I feel or how I'm satisfied with life or whether I'm thriving or whatever measure we're using. How do I get to a 0?
Yeah.
Well, that's reactive, that's resilient, that's break fix, and there is plenty of good use and utility for that, right? And people need to sometimes recognize whether things are in need of repair, right? And when you think about proactive, things that nourish, things that build, that's where we would argue instead of reactive and resilient, we're looking at proactive towards thriving and towards anti fragility, right? Build the things that nourish you. And part of what should nourish you should be tension and uncertainty and stressors and difficulty, not just perpetual comfort.
Mm. That's really good and really relevant to this generation of college students. And I hear this all the time from employers. So we've just hired someone who's come out of college and they want everything to feel good. And, or they're sort of missing this skill, right? Which is why we're doing this work. And I'd love to kind of double click now on maybe the framework that you and Adam approach the work with. I think I remember 3 pillars, if I got that right, of how you guys break down the work. But maybe just walk us through kind of from the high level down, how you guys
Sure,
think about
sure,
components of
sure.
anti-fragility.
So a lot of this is, when we talk about frameworks, we're talking about theoretical frameworks, right? Because
Yep.
we're in the middle of, we just finished a nice first draft of a scoping review on all anti-fragility research, but the kind of summary is it's early and we're
Yeah.
finding out a lot about it and there's a lot to be discovered, right? But
Yeah.
based on kind of our collection of sources from different fields, we'd make the argument that you want to think about 3 buckets. One is, let's call it build the good, or build the pleasant. So this is, you want to call it well-being or fulfillment or life satisfaction or whatever it might be. It's like loosely happiness. Okay. And we can get into all the nerdy nuances of that. I wrote my dissertation on it, but let's keep it simple for now. Bucket two is what I would say resilience and anti-fragility to a certain extent, because again, resilience is kind of reactive to an adversity. And it generally means I either am robust and don't take much of a hit, or I'm buoyant and I bounce back to baseline. Anti-fragility is proactive, as I said earlier, but it also takes it a step further because we leverage the adversity. We actually grow stronger and better because of it. So that's a primary distinguisher, right?
Yeah.
So you're developing the ability to build your own well-being, to respond to adversity you do not choose, to thoughtfully and strategically take on adversity you do choose, anti-fragility, right?
Yeah.
And then the third bucket is what we refer to as performance, but let's be really clear about that. We don't mean necessarily performance metrics or awards and accolades. We mean find the systems, the tools, the mental skills, whatever it might be, to be really good at the stuff you care about,
Yeah.
the stuff that's going to build the well-being, the stuff that's going to help you be resilient, the stuff that's going to create the anti-fragility, and the stuff that you just, you enjoy or you're interested in or you're passionate about, that's going to help build the well-being as well. Right. And so it's a pretty integrated framework of thinking about these different important elements of the human experience. Right. Now there's another 4-part framework underneath that, but I'll pause there.
No, I mean that's really good. I mean, my mind is already turning to a few things and maybe we go to that 4-part framework underneath it. But I think it's worth a call out that the real framework is just an acronym. And in fact, a lot of the material that I think you're going to cover for anti-fragility kind of cuts across the
It
various
does.
acronyms, right? And so
Yes.
I'll just make that call out for those who are watching and taking interest in this work. But yeah, let's move into the four. Now that we know the kind of like the three pillars and how you think about it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in coaching work in general, right, or let's say human performance, human potential work, really the predominant framework for how people feel, how they change behaviors, whatever it might be, has been biopsychosocial. So we have kind of simplified that language and then added a fourth part to it. So biopsychosocial for us is top down, bottom up, outside in. So what is bio? It's bottom up. It's recognizing, let's call it, kind of mind body connection, 100% nervous system, and not siloing, let's say, how we feel or mental health or well being or cognitive performance from the body, energy in, energy out, sleep, those sorts of things. Right. Top down is going to be thinking about your thinking. So this is primarily cognitive. This is a meta awareness. This is expectancy theory. This is mindsets. This is cognitive behavioral techniques, acceptance commitment techniques, but it's primarily happening sort of in the head, thinking
Yeah.
about our thinking, a lot of self-talk, right? Outside in is environmental. We do not thrive, right? We're not languishing. We're not anti-fragile or fragile in a vacuum. That's
Right.
all happening in the context of environment and relationships. So physical environment, but also social environment as well. So this is things like social contagion, different interesting science around like acts of kindness and altruism. It, I think, brings in the science of meaning and purpose, which is typically other people oriented. It just recognizes that if we're not paying attention to what we surround ourselves with or who we surround ourselves with, we're putting a cap on sort of our ability to, I think, create the sort of life we want to create, right,
Yeah.
day to day. So the fourth part is inside out. And so, we've been rolling this one around a little bit more, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And I'll give Adam a shout out here, Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals, and my co-founder. He randomly texted me about this, I don't know, maybe a month ago, and we just started going back and forth about it, which tells you what nerds we are that we just text about shit like this. But inside out is a recognition that a few different components are really, really critical to living a good life which includes a sense of character and integrity, which means we often can stick to our values regardless of how they feel, which is hard, which is hard, right? And so, what that requires generally is a few things: knowing what the values are, okay, which is a way we relate to the world, core beliefs about how we should behave, and hopefully what we get in return for that behavior, right?
Yeah.
Sense of justice or fairness or loyalty or whatever it might be. There's many, many values. Those values are very often grounded in what? A sense of meaning and or purpose, which might come from religion, it might come from spirituality. We've talked about some of these things, in past conversations as well. I wouldn't call those top down. I wouldn't call those bottom up. Certainly, there's elements of outside in because so much of it is influenced by ideas we get from other people and cultures and community. But ultimately, it's a projection inside out of how we see and sort of relate to the world, right? And so, failing to think about or honor or acknowledge that is again kind of leaving a lot on the table.
That's right. That's right. As we're talking, what I want people to know is as we kind of go into, we're just doing a quick overview of the four pillars and the concepts, and we'll go into them in greater depth. And even as you're talking over these ideas with, especially like Inside Out, I almost want to role play being a Gen Z and echoing what I'm hearing in focus groups and have you walk me through how we would unpack some topics, but we'll do that down the line. Um,
Sure.
One of the curiosities I have almost instantly that you and I have talked about offline, but I'd love to bring it online is the distinction. There's a lot of conversation in our culture right now around resilience. And how do you think about the relationship between resilience and anti-fragility? Like where are we in the evolution of work of developing, let's call it human potential, well-being, performance, uh, between those two topics, resilience and anti-fragility? How do they relate? How are they different in your mind? And what are some of
Mm-hmm.
the nuances there?
So my bachelor's degree is in history, as you know, right? And
Yeah.
I had other degrees in basically like social sciences and geography and religious studies, and I taught this for a long time. And so I'm thinking about sort of the trajectory of, let's say, humanity. And it seems to me that it fits really nicely with what we know from a lot of the research that the default for most people is actually resilience.
Yep.
We're generally pretty good at adapting to or getting used to hardship or difficult, right, unpleasant emotions. Um, I do not want to sort of repeat or give fire to, I think, talking points that are sometimes politicized and that I don't necessarily agree with or coming from, let's call it nefarious characters. But there is something to be said for a crisis of comfort, and that maybe we, in some cases, for those of us that are fortunate enough or privileged enough or lucky enough to just have, very positive circumstances, we've tipped the scales to a point where there's not enough friction in some cases. In some cases, there's not enough difficulty. Now, I'm really hesitant to say that because there's all sorts of existential angst. There's sort of global crises and lots of sort of geopolitical issues, and we're all acutely aware. So I'm not trying to make it sound like anyone, let alone Gen Z, are just sitting there picking flowers and having a good time all day. But by comparison to the way people used to live, it seems to me that we have always been very resilient. And maybe we need to start finding ways to be a little more proactive about it because modern life, I'm thinking of Chris Ryan, who we just had on the podcast. Modern life, in some cases, has maybe moved us away from some of those more natural capacities.
Yeah, I was doing some work implementing this with one of our pilot partners at a technical college, and one of the leaders at that college was designing the course with us, and he had come from Europe, and he had this really great exercise he walked students through where they went through times in their life where they had demonstrated resilience, and I think to your point, like resilience is a thing that each of us have and have exercised in many ways. And so as we lean into, I think we're at a really interesting time in history as we lean into, you mentioned all of these cultural and sort of geopolitical influences. Also, I think the rate of change and the rate of the speed of change happening
Yes.
right now, especially as AI comes online, right? Like now, I'm really curious about how this rate of change encourages us towards anti-fragility and anything that you might have comments on in that direction.
Well, just about, well, I shouldn't say just about any, but I mentioned we're writing that scoping review, and I can think of probably at least, I don't know, four or five, maybe a half a dozen different peer reviewed papers coming out of different fields like organizational management, leadership, supply chain, logistics that basically, so, for listeners, like a little nerdy, but if you write or read a peer reviewed paper, you're typically going to see an abstract at the start of it, which is more or less like 150, 250 word summary of kind of what the article is about, what some of the main takeaways are. And then immediately after that, you're going to see framing a need for this study. And a bunch of these articles basically say the need to understand and study anti-fragility is coming from things like AI and various geopolitical issues, right? Like you can see the context starting to require proactive thinking about how starting to deal with events like you and I talked about before we hit record, black swans, like, the current fires happening in LA where we both lived for a long time. Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's such a poignant moment to be talking about this, given everything that's happening around us. So we've covered like the high level three, the bottom up, top down, outside in, inside out. If you can kind of just walk us down a click deeper and some of the component parts that sort of consistently come up in your work when you built out an entire library and set of modules around this, you've coached, hundreds of high performing executives as well as young people in different contexts, athletes, career. What are themes, common sort of key components that come up when you're thinking about anti-fragility?
Number one is, are you ready for it?
Yeah.
Because plenty of people are in need of repair, right? And so, like, so let's take a client of ours, right? And we generally work with just not only high performing professionals, but kind of high burnout professions.
Yeah.
So law, medical, athletics, whatever it might be. And so let's say we're dealing with, as is often the case, somebody with burnout, right? They're not ready for anti-fragility. We got to fix the burnout, right? Like we got to fix the problem. If they've got all these things on their plate and are sort of like metaphorically drowning, the strategy should not be, hey, here's the weight of a 5 step morning routine that'll make you more anti-fragile, right? That's just going to cause them to sink further. And so the first step should be, and listen, Taleb talks about this kind of a little bit in anti-fragile, but you might think of it as via negativa. Get rid of the bad, get rid of the negative, not necessarily the unpleasant, the useless,
Yeah.
the waste, right? The things that'll help you clear your plate or kind of get back on track so you can get from -5 or 4 or 3 back to zero, bare minimum, homeostasis, not chronic stress, not distress mode, right? Homeostatic. And then you can start to think about, okay, if things are in a good place, things are comfortable, how do I kind of maintain the edge in more meaningful ways? I always like to use Paul Bloom's word from The Sweet Spot. Paul Bloom's at Yale psychologist, chosen suffering, right? And I don't mean that in some sort of like masochistic way, but like there's meaning in what I'm doing because it's hard or difficult in some way, shape, or form, right? Like I taught for years, and in LA, we would take every couple of weeks. I'd take student groups down to Skid Row, and we'd go to Union Rescue Mission. We'd serve dinner, those sorts of things. They do a tour. They'd meet with people that were living there and kind of learn about the programs, yada yada yada. See the juxtaposition, as you well know, of like you can stand on the roof of this place in Skid Row, and you can look across Los Angeles Street and see all the banks in LA. It's this juxtaposition of like extreme wealth and extreme poverty, right? It's hard. It's difficult. It's not a pleasant experience, but man, do they love it. Man, do they feel good after, right? And those are the sort of things that we're talking about here, not useless, pointless, meaningless suffering.
Right. That's really good. Um, as So as you move from, let's call it entropic forces to sort of stabilized and then, towards kind of meaningful engagement, what other things arise as you're working with clients or as you're teaching this work?
Yeah. We're starting to see, I think, more and more, let's call it triangulation around some consistent components. So I'm thinking of some different articles from like Baba Jaba et al. That we've got kind of up on our social that created a anti-fragility measure, another one from Jack Sy with a different anti-fragility measure, and then a theoretical article from Brendan Markey Towler that talks about personality. And what you, I think, start to see are some kind of interesting takeaways that I think you find in other fields and other lines of research and that are useful here. And so, um, number one is it's malleable. If personality is malleable and some things can be shifted, right, from not just states, occasional states, but to actual traits, then what that suggests is a requirement of becoming, say, more anti fragile is a growth mindset.
Mm,
It's unavoidable, right? And what tends to kind of accompany something like that? Having challenge mindsets versus threat mindsets,
yep.
having tend and befriend mindsets instead of lone wolf mindsets, right? You're never going to be as anti-fragile solo as you will be in a pack, so to speak, right? The flexibility of having some both and thinking, not siloed either or thinking, right? And so you can see right away mindsets in general as a category is a really, really important first step because you're actually shifting some sort of perception of how you live or reality from let's just stop the bad to let's build the good and the meaningfully unpleasant.
Yep.
That in itself is a philosophical or mindset shift,
Yep.
right?
And do you file mindset in the top down category?
Well, so I mean, like the simple answer is in the perfect world, we wouldn't have to categorize, right? Because it's
Yeah.
sort of like all one system.
Hmm.
But if you take sort of like we're primarily psychologists, if you take some of the research there, so predominantly something like Aaliyah Crumb's work, on stress mindsets. I like her definition. Adam likes her definition. It's a bridge between the conscious and subconscious. So it's a set of beliefs that maybe in part we're somewhat unaware of, and then to a certain extent we're aware of as well. Okay. And so generally the research we have there suggests that you can shift some of those things from a top down approach like journaling and trying to feed what is conscious into the subconscious. If there's bottom up approaches, I don't know if there aren't, but I'm just not aware of them.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay. So mindsets is a big chunk. What else comes up for you?
So if you want to impact mindsets or anything else, you have to be able to control attention and awareness. You have to catch thoughts. You have to catch feelings. You have to catch behaviors. You have to catch habits, right? It's the fundamental foundation of any sort of behavior change or mindset change, which we just talked about. So in some ways, this is sequential. This comes first. So that is training up mindfulness. That's training up attentional capacity, right? That's training up the ability to sustain different levels of attention in different ways for different purposes. It's actually training being able to not pay attention. There are strategic advantages to mind wandering, for instance. It does different things for different reasons. That's why it exists. A lot of us just don't leverage it very well because we think it's wasting time. We're not actively doing something, right? So all of this would get filed under being able to control and kind of manipulate awareness and attention so that you can do some of these other anti-fragile mindsets, behaviors, those sorts of things. I mentioned via negativa earlier. That's going to be a component of it. So great if you have the mindset, great if you have awareness and intention. But if you have a bunch of crap in your way, we talk about in cognitive load theory, it's extraneous. It's
Right.
more than what is germane or naturally difficult about living or doing the thing, right? So it's wasteful, it's inefficient in some way, right? Um, I think Taleb uses the language of a barbell approach, and the way we've thought about that and strategized is for people to keep in mind that anti-fragility, the goal is still more consistent thriving. The goal is to not live in purposeful trauma-inducing misery in hopes it'll make you anti-fragile. And so this is a both and approach. Build what is pleasant and take on what is meaningfully unpleasant. Right. So that's going to be a big part of it. I'm trying to think. Oh, probably the biggest one, cognitive flexibility,
Right.
or emotional agility, right? The ability to engage with, endure, and learn to actually frame and leverage unpleasant experiences. So you're not just locking yourself into one side of life's emotional sort of spectrum.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so that's a variety of different things that are top down, bottom up, outside in, et cetera. But that's a huge one, right? And actually, it's worth highlighting because sometimes anti-fragility sounds like, oh, mental toughness or just suck it up or like nothing should ever bother you. It's not that at all. It's not rigid. It's flexible. And so that idea of cognitive flexibility and emotional agility, to use Susan David's word, is central to it.
That's awesome. Yeah, and when we dropped in, you sort of articulated this traditional break fix model that we find ourselves in. But in my experience of your work and how you and Adam are thinking about this, I'm so drawn to the idea of proactive training or proactive practice as kind of the anecdote to the break fix paradigm, right? And so I imagine within all of these things, whether it's mindset, whether it's awareness, there are practices, there are ways that you can sort of train yourself proactively to develop a way of being that's anti-fragile. Is that right?
I think theoretically, yes. And we are starting to be able to say empirically, we think so. So
Right.
that's like a kind of, tempered academic answer. But if you want to take the idea of like thriving through adversity and take things like post-traumatic growth versus PTSD, right? And benefit finding from positive psychology or silver lining it, and all these sort of things that suggest we can benefit from these difficult things, um, then I think it's more than fair to say some of the different evidence-based exercises that underpin those processes and support, let's call it robustness, right, or stealing when done proactively, not just reactively when shit hits the fan. Like, why wouldn't they be helpful if we're doing them intentionally? And so here's a simple example. Adam and I were on mental training lab earlier today with Pete, the director of mental performance for the Blackhawks, and we were talking about Chicago Blackhawks, and we were talking about this a little bit. We're currently working with a softball program, and I give the coach here a lot of credit, and I will make it public, but the coach came to us really a year before the season, right? And said the following, more or less, right? Given that in your baseball players who can appreciate this, given the timing of the spring collegiate season, conference tournament and NCAAs typically coincide with finals.
Yeah.
And it's hell.
Yeah.
It's just hell. And so, what does that sound like? That sounds like a volatile, complex, somewhat uncertain, chaotic environment. That is one that if you want to thrive in, you have to be anti fragile. Now, because she came to us early, it's a different experience than somebody who's receiving some of our training or coaching in season, which a lot of times is just about performance management week to week, dealing with teammates, coaches, whatever. This program is saying, okay, we're learning a lot of these skills and tools and techniques in advance. And then I'm going through one-on-ones with them right now. We have 2 or 3 months before the season to put ourselves into increasingly bigger and hotter flames, right? To sort of like um, form and steel ourselves against the inferno that is inevitably going to come, right? Which is that perfect storm of high pressure performance, academic performance, time scarcity, all those things. And so it's different than resilience because it's not, hey, our kids are miserable. Can you come in and help them with some stuff? It's no, we know this hard thing is coming. It's important to us. It's meaningful. Can we start to do some hard things along the way to get ourselves ready for it?
Right, right. Um, as you kind of use this hand motion of kind of elevated stress and challenge and dynamism, let's call it, I was also picturing and rising to that occasion. I was picturing a person going through that arc of realizing more and more of what they're capable of, more and more of what capacity they have as an individual. And as I thought about that, I was thinking back to the initial exploration of you gave a great kind of description of anti-fragility. If you were talking to sort of a college leader at this point in time and you were, you know, kind of making the case for why at this moment, like, why is it that they have not, and I guess this actually draws on your flourishing work as well. Like, why is it at this moment in time, given all that we know about these different dynamics, that it's only now reaching the consciousness of these leaders? And like, how would you talk to the leader about why it's so important for students to sort of understand these things, practice these things, implement these things for their success as they enter the work life? It's an unfair question because I didn't prep you for it, but
No,
I'm
it's fine.
curious what comes up.
Yeah, I mean, like my answer is a little oversimplification, but that like it's going to happen to them.
Mhm.
It's coming. Now, they might have to write that research paper. They might have to, for some reason, have a basic understanding of pre-effing calc, like I had to during my prereqs. They might have to take the American literature course about the books they've never heard of and will never discuss again. But they will 100% have to navigate hard stuff.
Yeah.
What else is more important for a school to do?
Amen.
And
That's right.
that's why you and I came together in the first place, because my attitude is kind of like, why the fuck aren't we doing this?
That's right. That's right. And if the job of college is to prepare people for success in life, from my perspective, there is no skill more important. There is no subject matter more important than these topics that we're talking about. And that kind of brings me full circle to like why we called them real skills. I think we're giving students an extraordinary surface area of skills and knowledge, but we're missing this piece. And it's sort of time that we drop it in and really zero in on the thing that's going to make a significant difference in the trajectory of their life, from where I'm coming from. And I guess from that place, I guess I would make an invitation to you, impromptu. Is there anything else, recognize? I'm so excited to dive into each of the topics you started on, kind of putting on the table, and we'll do that. We'll do that in future conversations. But just from the biggest picture around anti-fragility as a pillar of this work, is there anything else that you feel we missed or that would be good to call
Yeah,
out? Yeah.
yeah. And I mentioned this at the end of the conversation with Pete this morning as well. Um, One of the things that I think is starting to be revealed from better, more empirical research, not just theoretical research, but you also see pretty consistent in other lines of research, is the subjective nature of emotional experiences. And so, why is that important? So, if you're a coach listening, if you're a parent listening, if you're a professor or teacher listening, and you're walking away saying, oh, hell yeah, I'm going to make my kids or my students or my team or my family more anti fragile. Every one of those individuals is likely to respond to the same stressor in pretty different ways. They're likely to see it differently, experience it differently, maybe have slightly different emotions, and not all of them. But we really need, and so I mentioned the scoping review. Publishing this with Marcello Bigliassi, who's done some really awesome work around pain and sort of the neuroscience and psychology. And he's really good at thinking about basically a simple word: dosage. If you're trying to bring in a stressor, you need to be extremely careful because there's real threats and thoughtful about dosage for that specific individual, right? So Pete this morning asked us the question, sort of the genie question, if you could come up with sort of one tool or one thing for, human potential and performance. For me, that's what it would be, is that, my Aura Ring or a Whoop Band or whatever would have some sort of biofeedback that helps you dial in the right level of stress and challenge to build up over time so that you don't find out that you went too far the hard way.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I talk about this work a lot. Like, in the training context, I think a lot about the same way that we train our body. You wouldn't go to the gym and drop too much weight on yourself. That's not
Right.
going to help you build muscle. That's gonna hurt you, right?
It's going to make it worse.
But
Correct. Yeah.
there's a very clear through line between um, stressing your body appropriately to grow and develop muscle. And I'm sure the same applies to our psyches, our nervous system, as you mentioned earlier, and ultimately even our skill set, right? There's the growth zone and there's the danger zone of skill acquisition. And so I think
Yep.
that's an incredible call out. Yeah. Well, I think this is a really great first pass at anti-fragility. And I just, walk away from this conversation, as always, feeling grateful for your partnership in this work and excited to dive in further. But we'll call it good for today and move into liberation next chat.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you, man.
Thank you.